LinkedIn News.
We have this amazing adaptive stress response. So if there's a deadline or a crisis, we can meet that, and then our body should go back into homeostasis, which is like normalizing the levels of everything. And then depending on your age and gender, there's a normal range between which cortisol kind of fluctuates. And if something stressful happens, it spikes briefly and then it should carry on. But if you're chronically stressed, then there are receptors in the brain, because that cortisol is released from your adrenal glands above your kidneys, but it flows around your blood, crosses the blood-brain barrier, and the receptors in the brain monitor your stress levels like all the time. And so if your brain monitors that cortisol levels are high all the time, it thinks there's an impending threat to your life. So when you're in that stress mode and your brain is just taking up all this glucose and oxygen away from your body, one of the things that happens is the blood flow is moved down to what I call low power mode. So it's moved away from the highest functions of your brain. So that cortisol state is correlated with survival emotions like fear, disgust, shame, anger, sadness. The other end of the spectrum are the attachment emotions: love, trust, joy, and excitement. And the hormone that goes along with those is called oxytocin. And cortisol and oxytocin cannot exist in equal amounts. So they're like a seesaw. If one goes up, the other one goes down. And basically, my friend Chanel Haynes, who played Tina Turner in London's West End, she put it in a more practical way, which I loved, which I picked up from her completely, which is that fear and love cannot coexist.
So that's Dr. Tara Swart. I'm Leah Smart, and this is Everyday Better. Make sure you hit that follow button to get new episodes of our podcast every week. Stay tuned for some of Tara's most important findings so far in her work as a neuroscientist and the brain-body connection. Our show starts in just a few moments. Hey everyone, from LinkedIn News, I'm Leah Smart, and this is Everyday Better, a personal development podcast where every week I sit down with some of the world's brightest minds and bravest hearts to learn how we can improve ourselves, our relationship to others, and the world around us. Today, I got to sit down in the studio with Dr. Tara Swart, a neuroscientist, medical doctor, senior lecturer at MIT Sloan, and author of the best-selling book, The Source: The Secrets of the Universe, The Science of the Brain. It's been translated in 38 global territories. And during Mental Health Awareness Month, I want us to explore ways to sustain emotional well-being, which is how we handle stress, adapt to change, and deal with tough times. And Tara, like me, is passionate about disseminating really simple neuroscience-based messages that change the way that all of us live and work. She's explaining the inexplicable, like the science behind vision boards, that stress isn't just a talking point. It's a real problem that plays out in the brain-body connection, and things like how stating your intentions actually does impact your brain's interpretation of what you do next. I am so excited to introduce you to her and to give you some of the powerful ways to approach your own emotional well-being, not just from a place of what you're lacking or what's going wrong, but with the intention of helping you flourish. Here's Tara.
I was brought up in London, but my parents had emigrated from India, so they brought a lot of like the Indian cultural heritage with them. My mother practiced yoga, used incense and believed in ancestors. But, all of my friends were just English young people who didn't have that sort of thing in their background, in their life. So I think I learned from a young age to kind of like separate my home life to my school life, and later separate my personal spiritual practice from being a Western medical doctor, because I then went to medical school. And when we were allowed to choose special topics, chose everything neuroscience that I could. I just found it so fascinating. So neuroanatomy, neurophysiology, neuropharmacology. And then I got the opportunity to do my PhD, thinking I would specialize to become a neurologist. But in the practical sense of seeing what it was like, what you'd be dealing with as a neurologist, like brain tumors, brain abscesses, strokes. And then, doing the psychiatry module and hearing people say, I can hear voices outside of my ear as if there's a person there, but there's no one there. I just thought that would be, much more interesting for me to be able to use my person skills and like talk to people rather than deal with sort of more physical things. So then I specialized as a psychiatrist. And about 7 years in, I had travelled the world a little bit with my career. I had practiced child psychiatry, old age, vulnerable females, criminal psychiatry, learning disabilities. And I think I did all of that because I wasn't quite finding, my purpose.
Yep.
And then eventually I thought about leaving medicine, which was a very difficult decision. Took me about 2 years to actually do it. And that's when executive coaching had sort of filtered down from the US to the UK and was a bit more of a popular thing. So I retrained in that. And it was the time of the financial crisis. So I found my niche as a former psychiatrist dealing with extremely stressed executives. It was both the mental side of things with a lot of high-profile suicides and the physical side of things. I was mostly working with investment banks and people were literally dropping dead of heart attacks on trading floors. This was 15, 16 years ago. The brain-body connection was not understood and appreciated. So when I was asked to help with this crisis of a medical issue that seemed to be going on the trading floor, but I also was working with other areas of the bank and knew that the employee engagement was an issue, I said to them, those two things are connected. I can't just bring my knowledge as a medical doctor to help with these heart attacks. When we looked, these people were young and healthy. They didn't have high blood pressure. They didn't have high cholesterol or diabetes. I said, they're all extremely stressed. And that's where I need to put my work. But they couldn't understand that. So they didn't want me to do that. And I said, I will fail if I can't do it this way. So I'm not going to do it. Just get medical doctors in to help with the people who, haven't died but have got heart issues,
right,
if that's what you want to do. But I'm telling you, it's caused by stress. And then it was still a while. It was about 3 years into my career change that neuroscience became like a buzz topic in business and leadership. And I started giving talks. And at first I thought, well, I'll do a talk because I might get a coaching client. And then I realized these talks are really powerful. They're reaching more people. I could speak to 100, 200, 300 people in an hour and start teaching them about stress. And the first time I gave a talk for a big company, in the break, people came up to me and said, you've got to take back what you've just said about stress because everybody's out there and they're terrified that they're all going to die of a heart attack. And I said, well, no, if they've heard what I've said and they're terrified they're going to have a heart attack, then I need to tell them how to help them know how to change, not take back what I've said.
Pretend you didn't say it. Right. How is that logical?
It really, I do think, comes to the fact that we just knew so little about how the brain worked. And even when I was doing my PhD, we didn't know about neuroplasticity, which is the fact that the brain grows and changes throughout life. We thought when you turned 18 and you stopped growing that your brain was fixed. I remember when I came back to medical school, one of the consultants said to me, we've got a new CT scanner in the hospital, so we won't just have to do x-rays anymore. And I remember thinking, and I'm sure you've realised how progressive my thinking is now, but at the time I was like, oh, I don't know what this CT scanner is, but I don't think I'll ever use it.
Get it out of here.
Yeah. And now it's CT, MRI, functional MRI, diffusion tensor imaging, and it's just showing the world how beautiful and intricate and complex and sophisticated the brain is.
I often wonder about what it's like to be someone who's an academic that also then wants to go out into the world and share. Because I hear, through grapevines that it can be really difficult to do that, to kind of cross those lines. And I also think it is such a beautiful and privileged position, right, is to go out into the world and share this. How do you think about your responsibility as a neuroscientist, as someone with all of this information when it comes to sharing with the general public? And what's your intention behind your work?
That is probably the favourite question I've ever been asked. I actually slightly feel like crying because no one's ever asked me that before.
That makes me want to cry now. Tell me the neuroscience behind that.
As you were asking the question, I thought I'm going to start by saying intention is the most important thing when it comes to everything, really. And I can come back to some of the science of that. So I'm going to tell you the actual story of what happened, which is that just before I realised that neuroscience was this, could be spoken about, I had had a really, really tough time changing career because most coaches are either psychologists or they're retired business people. And I didn't fit into either of those categories. And I remember a headhunter who is now a very good friend of mine who helped me a lot. He was obviously testing me, but he said, why would I ever recommend you to a client when I've got these grey-haired, very experienced former CEOs? That's who people will want. It'll be easier for me to recommend them. And I had a very powerful response to that. I don't know how at the time, because I was not very, as confident as I am now, but I said, I will be better than all of them.
Wow.
And he believed me, clearly. And he said to me, there's a talk from a coaching company where they're explaining how neuroscience can be used in coaching. Do you want to go to it? And I said, I've got no interest in going to that talk, but I'd like to spend the time with you, so I'll come. So we went to it, and the person who was speaking may have had some kind of psychological background, but definitely like no neuroscience background. And at the end of it, we came out, and I said to my friend, I am so annoyed by this talk because this person was using such complicated words to bamboozle people into thinking that they're smart and we're not. And I've got a PhD in neuroscience. If I couldn't follow it, nobody else in that room could. Mm-hmm. And he just looked at me and he said, what are you going to do about it?
You got to go do it. Yeah.
And I looked back at him and I said, you've tricked me into this. And I think the thing is, I don't really consider myself an academic. I consider myself more of a translator. Mm-hmm. And the best compliment that I can get from people is you make complex things so simple and applicable to people's lives, because I don't understand the point of it if you don't do that.
So talk to me about the importance of science behind intention, because I haven't heard that.
Yeah, so let me tell you about the science. You've heard about intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating. Mm-hmm. So intermittent fasting is where you go down to 500 calories for women or 600 for men on 2 non-consecutive days of the week. And you can imagine you have to be very intentional about that. You have to know exactly what you can and can't eat. And that's very good for your mental and physical resilience as a result of it. Mm-hmm. If people say, and I had someone say this to me recently, I'm just so busy that I often skip meals anyway, so I'm basically doing time-restricted eating. Actually, the effect of doing that is not just neutral in your brain, it's detrimental to your brain. So your brain knows the difference between whether you're missing meals on purpose or by mistake.
Wow.
And what happens in terms of your stress or resilience response to that is good or bad.
Wow.
And it's the same with daydreaming. So if you're supposed to be focusing on a task, but your mind drifts off, that's bad. But if you take the time to go for a nature walk and you think, what could I do differently in my podcast in future? What kind of guests could I have? That's actually good for your brain. But behind all of that, my intention is, well, it's always been to help people, being a doctor and a coach. But a real time of change for me was the start of the pandemic. I realised within about 2 weeks that there was going to be a massive mental health consequence of what was going on. And then as it went on, I thought we're heading for an absolute crisis here. Or it could be an opportunity for a spiritual revolution. And the book having come out in 2019, sort of like some way into 2020, 2021, I did notice that people were reading it again or more, or new people were reading it. And for me, personally, I went from kind of, living in London, going to lots of meetings, being very sociable, to living in the countryside, just a tiny family, not really seeing people, growing my own vegetables, walking barefoot outside, being surrounded by nature. But then I also thought, what a privilege. There are people who are cramped into tiny conditions, who have to work and have homeschooling going on at the same time, who might be finding it more difficult to get food than we were at the time. And that was really when I started doing as much free stuff on Instagram and other social media, LinkedIn, to everything as I could. Because I just thought, well, I can sit at home and do this and it might really help people.
I love the multiple things you talked about here, but the way that you talk about being a translator, because I think that's really powerful. It's like you are doing the work and studying the work in order to share it with people who will probably never do the amount of work or study that you are doing, but so benefit from it. And in my mind, I go, well, what's the point of all this work if we can't share it, if we can't help change the world with it?
Yeah.
Can you give us your perception of what you mean when you say spiritual revolution?
I think we did have a mental health crisis in the pandemic. I think we're still in a mental health crisis. I think that long COVID is not just a physical virus, it's a mental health problem. So from what I'm seeing, what started as a loss of sense of connection to self or loss of purpose, a breakdown of many relationships, marriages, friendships, working relationships, and actual loss through death, which a lot of people experienced in the last 2-3 years, that has certainly made me question, like, there's got to be more to life than this. And maybe even start questioning, there's got to be more to life than can be explained by science currently. So I think people are still really suffering.
Yeah.
And that if you don't have, let's just pick grief through actual death, because it's big, it's very final. If you don't have any spiritual or religious or personal beliefs around that, so if your belief is that if somebody dies, that's it, they're dead and gone, there's no spirit, there's no possible connection to that person that you loved, I don't know how people ever get over that. If you are open to the possibility, let's keep it scientific, that consciousness may be able to exist after physical death, that could bring people so much comfort. And I'm not saying it's true, and I can't prove that it's true, but I would just like us to open up the conversation that if we could hypothesize that that might be true, what might we do differently? What conversations might we even open up? Because I feel like people are too afraid to have those conversations because you'll think they're crazy.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously in starting my research, I have asked a few people about if they've ever had experiences like that. And let me ask you one question.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever thought of someone that you haven't been in touch with for a while and they just crossed your mind and then suddenly they messaged you?
Of course.
I haven't had a single person say no to that. How is that possible?
I've had multiple times where my mom will call me when I'm really in some sort of emotional turmoil. Mm-hmm. And this has happened so many times, I will tell you, I get annoyed with her. I'm like, stop calling me, get out of my brain. But she feels it, and she tells me she feels it. And I don't know how to not believe that because my evidence tells me that that's also true.
Yeah. And I was getting goosebumps as you were saying that. And one of the things I want to research is, why do we get goosebumps when our intuition feels like it's right, or we feel like somebody said something that has some kind of like psychic possibility? I really want to look into that. So that question of, does anybody call you or message you when, you've been thinking of them or you're in deep emotional need? I literally haven't had anyone say no to that yet.
Okay.
In other conversations, only obviously if I know people who've lost a loved one, where I have started to, ask, gently inquire about, did you ever feel them, see them, hear them again? There's more people that will say yes to that than you would imagine, because I think we just don't have those conversations. Mm-hmm. In terms of the connection to self, which I think is really important, because I think that's the key to then having connection with community and then, possibly connection with people that are no longer here, is one that I used to struggle with when the source came out, is that a few people would write to me and say, but I don't know what I want. I don't know what my purpose is. And so I didn't really know how to answer it. So I started saying, well, maybe just create an imagery of like what you'd like your life to feel like. That was an answer that came from my logic. Now that time has gone on and we've faced a pandemic and we're still recovering from it really, I think that this is a much bigger issue than I realised, this loss of sense of self, loss of connection to self, loss of purpose. But I feel like modern science and the modern world and the material plane have given us a ceiling to what our best self could be. And I think there's a way to break through that ceiling.
I want to give people practical guidance around how they can use this, I don't know if you'd call it inner wisdom or what it is. Manifestation, of course, is very popular, and has become really popular recently. So I don't know if it's that, but how do we use the tools that you're talking about to become our best selves?
Let's put it in super scientific terms. We have this amazing adaptive stress response. So, if there's a deadline or a crisis, we can meet that, and then our body should go back into homeostasis, which is like normalizing the levels of everything. And we also have a 24-hour clock, which is connected to the light-dark cycle outside. And so melatonin helps us to fall asleep and cortisol helps us to wake up. And so that means that in 24 hours, our cortisol levels are highest just before we wake up. And then depending on your age and gender, there's a normal range between which cortisol kind of fluctuates. And if something stressful happens, it spikes briefly and then it should carry on like, whatever the range is. But if you're chronically stressed, like most of us absolutely were during the pandemic, and I believe still are really, then there are receptors in the brain, because that cortisol is released from your adrenal glands above your kidneys, but it flows around your blood, crosses the blood-brain barrier, and the receptors in the brain monitor your stress levels like all the time. And so if your brain monitors that cortisol levels are high all the time, it thinks there's an impending threat to your life. And so a couple of mechanisms take place, but one of them is that the blood flow to your brain, now your brain is tiny, 2 to 3% of your body weight. You can't see it, so we're not always aware of it every day, but it's the most energy hungry organ in the body. It's eating up 20 to 30% of the breakdown products of what we eat in a day. When you're asleep, your brain is using up 20% of what you ate that day.
Wow.
Right now, like you're focusing and engaged, it's using up 25%. And if you were super stressed, it would be using up 30. So when you're in that stress mode and your brain is just taking up all this glucose and oxygen away from your body, one of the things that happens is the blood flow is moved down to what I call low power mode. So it's a move away from the highest functions of your brain. And that's things like the ability to regulate your emotions, override your biases, think outside the box, solve complex problems, think creatively, trust people. It's like, we don't need that to survive right now. So let's just keep the blood for just what I need to do to put food on the table, keep my most critically important relationships alive, and just get enough sleep and food to survive till this crisis passes. So that cortisol state is correlated with survival emotions like fear, disgust, shame, anger, sadness. The other end of the spectrum are the attachment emotions, love, trust, joy, and excitement. And the hormone that goes along with those is called oxytocin. It's the same one that you get when you're giving birth, when you're breastfeeding, when you're gazing at your newborn baby and you're in that love bubble. And cortisol and oxytocin cannot exist in equal amounts. So they're like a seesaw. If one goes up, the other one goes down. And basically, my friend Chanel Haynes, who played Tina Turner in London's West End, she put it in a more practical way, which I loved, which I picked up from her completely, which is that fear and love cannot coexist. I mean, that's such an old quote, and now it's backed up by science.
Yes.
It's insane.
Oh, that's amazing. Which I'm like that. Actually, I didn't realize that. Yes. Wow.
Yeah. So if you think about being highly stressed and you're in your low power mode, your blood supply is reduced. When you're in love, trust, then the blood supply is flowing throughout your brain. You're more likely to take healthy risks, collaborate with people, be creative. And one thing I didn't mention is that in these states, our access to our intuition changes as well. So when we're stressed, we're anyway more likely to be bloated or have diarrhea or just have reflux. Any digestive problems are highly correlated to the stress hormone. When we're in an oxytocin state, that gut-brain connection is clear. We can trust ourselves. The trust isn't always about trusting other people. It's about trusting yourself. So that's when intuition is good. And I think what I'm proposing is a third state that we can't explain yet, that's an even higher state than that, which is that you're not stressed, you're loving and trusting, you've got good access to your intuition, and then whatever it is that comes next that's even a bit more than intuition, maybe you have the ability to access that. And we do know that when people meditate, that the brain wave changes that we see in people who are regular meditators or even at the time of meditation is potentially opening us up to thinking outside the box, thinking of an alternative reality, seeing, a possible future. So I think it's just all an extrapolation of that.
We're heading out for a quick break. But first, let's recap what Tara just said. We cannot have the stress hormone and the hormone that goes along with higher emotions, oxytocin, exist in equal amounts. When we have more of the latter, we basically fire up the best versions of ourselves. We're more creative, we're more connected in important relationships at home and at work, and we are contagious in a positive way to those around us. So, when we come back, she's going to share how we get connected to these higher emotions. And we're back with Dr. Tara Swart. So we talk a lot about meditation on this show. What we've talked about less that's connected to your work around potential is visualization. And I've heard you share a couple different studies and things like this that are connected to it. Can you talk about what that is and what it does? And is there science behind it?
So, funnily enough, a lot of people can't visualize, and it's called aphantasia.
Wow.
Yeah. So I'm guessing from your response that you can. So if I asked you to close your eyes and see an apple, you would see an image of an apple. Yeah.
Right.
So some people, it's kind of a spectrum thing. Some people can see like a round blob, but it's not exactly an apple. And some people can't see anything. And so that's why I'm such a proponent of vision boards, because then you've got something to look at. So it's either closing your eyes and visualizing, or it's staring intently at a vision board that you've made. And personally, I think of those as forms of meditation. So for me, meditation is just as much as it could be sitting down with your eyes closed, and that could be monitoring your thoughts or using a mantra or focusing on your breath. It's also visualization. It's also looking at your vision board. It's also practicing gratitude. It's also chanting or listening to mantras and dancing and drumming and all these ancient things that we did. And think, when we lived in the cave, we didn't have resources to do anything that wasn't crucial to our survival, but we chanted and we drummed and we sang and we danced. And we don't know why we did those things, except all we know is they must have been crucial to our survival. We wouldn't have done them.
Wow.
But equally, if you are dancing, chanting, drumming, you do go into a transcendental state. We also know that some of those ancient cultures actually buried people for several days to induce a near-death experience. And then those people became the mystics and the seers of the clan. So, almost experiencing death or experiencing like darkness until you understand that you can create light in darkness. And there are dark retreats you can go on now in California. Yeah.
Wow. So what you're saying then is they were getting people to the edge of life to get them to be better at living.
And more than just better at living, but, to have these extra expanded consciousness powers that ordinary people didn't have.
Wow.
So I've also read After by Dr. Bruce Grayson, who I interviewed on my podcast. He is one of the most wonderful people alive. So his work is on near-death experiences. I interviewed Dr. Nida on dark retreats and lucid dreaming, and Dr. Alexander Bathiani on terminal lucidity, which is when people whose brains are very damaged, people who've had dementia for years or had strokes where they haven't recovered very well, and the people with dementia particularly who don't recognize their own children, don't even know that they had children. And then suddenly they become completely lucid and they say, Leah, honey, come over here. I just want to tell you that as your mom, I always feel how you're feeling. And sorry, I don't want to make you cry again.
Wow. I'm not going to cry, but I'm wow, this is beautiful. Yeah.
And that usually happens 1 to 24 hours before death. But what it does show us is that in an extremely physically damaged brain with an altered blood supply, with degeneration of nerve cells, you can be completely lucid, access all of your cognition and your memory. That's when, as a scientist, you start thinking, and this is making my eyes sting, how do we know that that means you're gone when you're dead? Because that brain should not be working.
Mm-hmm. Ooh, that's a huge question. Yeah. You were talking about vision boards and the power of vision boards for people, especially because, and I forget the term you use, but for people who do not have the ability.
Aphantasia.
Aphantasia. Wow. Okay. So talk to me about that, because I kind of want to connect the dots when you think about your work of being in this academic space or in this science space, translating, but also your recent draw to ancient wisdom.
Yeah.
What are you trying to do? It just came to me.
Sweet.
I don't know.
That's very sweet. So the visualization thing actually has been in my life for a lot longer. And it actually comes from very, very old now sports psychology. So visualization isn't a new thing really at all. So, a lot of sports people will do mental rehearsal as well as actual practice of their sport. And then when it comes up to just before competition, they will actually, close their eyes and see themselves, whether it's skiing or horse riding or whatever, all the way to the end. And they'll kind of make sure that they actually know what the road, the terrain is like and everything.
Right.
And same for me, I didn't obviously really do it today, but especially if I'm giving a speech and I know there's going to be hundreds of faces looking at me, I always go and look at the room before I give the speech. If I can do it the night before, I will. But if I can't do it till the day, I'll still try and do it before I actually walk onto the stage. And suddenly I'm in this environment I've never been in with loads of lights and loads of people staring at me, because whose brain isn't going to go, panic. Yeah. And I picked up a trick from the Springbok rugby players that they eat a square of dark chocolate before they run onto the pitch, because your brain inevitably will get stressed by those crowds. And so rather than starting to draw glucose out of your muscles, if you've got a little bit of glucose available, your brain will use that, and then you've still got all the power that you need.
Wow.
So sometimes I do that. I always make sure I eat before I give an important speech. So visualization, I mean, personally, I started doing vision boards like 15, 16 years ago when I changed career. But what I've kind of learned over time, because before I would make the board, I would put it somewhere prominent and I would just look at it whenever I walk past it. But now I've got a clearer sort of methodology for making it, having it somewhere so prominent that at least once or twice every day, you spend some actual time looking at it, not just walking past it. And that you then close your eyes and you go through each of your senses and ask yourself what it feels like that these things are true. So let's say it's that, you have the #1 podcast in the USA. So I would ask you to close your eyes and say, what does it look like in your mind when that happens? What does it sound like to hear that? What does it smell like? What does it taste like? And just what does it feel like in your whole body? And, maybe even a little bit more like who else is there with you? Who's celebrating with you? Where are you? That kind of thing. So really immersing yourself in that full sensory experience. And once you're kind of like smiling and feeling like it's true, just giving an enormous amount of gratitude for it being true. Because what are you doing when you are giving gratitude? You're moving your state from cortisol to oxytocin. So you're taking yourself away from fear of the unknown to joy and excitement and trust of this future that you want to create.
And does it work?
It's worked for me and thousands of people in my DMs.
Yeah.
And I think there are reasons that it doesn't work as well. And we can go through those if you'd like.
Yeah, I'm curious. Yeah. If someone says like, I visualize being the next CEO of Google and it never happened for me, I always wonder about the skeptics.
Yeah, I feel for the skeptics too. But I think that, I've got an example of that where it's too unachievable. Like we have to be realistic. I am not like saying create a fantasy and sit at home and think it's going to come true. So I was doing Instagram Live with a good friend of mine who's a very successful businesswoman in the fashion industry. And she said that 10 years ago, I think it was, on her vision board, she wanted a house in the Hamptons. Now you can imagine the comments that came up on Instagram Live. Everybody wants a house in the Hamptons. But I know that she has worked blood, sweat and tears to get to where she got to and held that high aspiration, but with good reason, given the context of like where she was working and, how that was going. And I remember walking into that house and really feeling it felt different to if she'd like inherited it or something. It was like I knew like what had gone behind her, realizing that in the material world. And just whilst we're on that dream home kind of idea, I had this analogy for our brains, like as if it's your dream home. So imagine your dream home. If you got that house, would you never clean it? Would you have dead plants in it? Would you like not water the garden? But we treat our brains like that, but then expect to be the CEO of Google.
Right.
So I think, start with things that are achievable because actually that will accumulate in your brain as, yeah, I can do this. So even in my annual board, I'll have a few things that I feel like I have more control over and will be quicker wins. And then I have other things that I think I have no idea how that's going to come true, but let's see. And of course, I try to do as many of the right things I can to make those bigger things more likely to come true. So a classic example of this is someone who really all her friends are getting engaged and, you want to meet someone and settle down and have a family and it's not happening for you. But instead of taking all the right supplements that would be good for your fertility and having really good boundaries for dating people only who are looking for something serious, you're going out partying because you think that's how you're going to meet someone. But it's actually not the best way to get you to what you want. And it's sort of like, well, what can you be doing to make sure that that's more likely to come true, even if you can't necessarily like fully control the outcome?
Yeah. It's like put yourself in the way of the outcome at the very least. Yeah. And so when you think about how this applies, I know you started off this conversation sharing that you were working as a coach with people in finance. When you think about this conversation of, all the way back to stress and then visualization, right? Being kind of the opposite end of it, where you're creating something that is really powerful and meaningful. Stress where you're sort of shrinking and sort of becoming small because you have very little energy to give elsewhere. How do we apply this to our everyday lives? Like, how do we apply this to work and to the way that we contribute to the world, however that is?
Well, I'm actually going to answer this by saying something that you already said to me at the beginning. There's no better real answer to that question than the story of The Alchemist. Because, one of the things I do say about these super stressed, successful people is that you've forgotten that you're actually being paid to use your brain, but you're not looking after your brain in the way that you could, that would optimize it the most to make you the most resilient to stress, to make you the best manager or leader, to help you make the best decisions. So I think, in the words of both of our favorite novel, is that the treasure is already inside yourself. You just have to, find it and feed it and kind of, bring it to the surface. That's why isn't it one of the most popular books in the whole world ever? I mean,
Yes.
And these old parables, they're there for a reason because of what you repeated also from me, which is that all the things that we need to thrive in the modern world, they've already been around, right? We're just not doing them. We're just discarding them or forgetting them or saying that maybe if we actually woke up one day and thought, let's go back to nature, let's go back to respect, let's go back to living with the land and like having a place for everyone in our community, maybe that would be better for us.
Mm-hmm. And is that what you'd put on a billboard?
There are so many things I would want to put on a billboard.
You're like, I'm buying up
Don't
all
make
the
me
billboards
choose,
on the highways. Yeah.
Can I have a question instead of a statement?
Sure. Love that.
My question, and I'm obsessed with this concept at the moment, is, and I would love to think of people driving on autopilot on a highway and looking at this and really thinking about this. When was the last time, if ever, that you felt truly seen? I think this is like an issue in the world at the moment. And I think that if we spent more time thinking about that and why it's a problem, I think amazing things could happen.
Do you think it's a block that we have in being able to be vulnerable enough to be seen, or that we aren't making the time to see each other?
I feel like this gets neglected from very early in childhood. I feel like parental expectation, societal expectation, and then it gets like, in school taught out of us, churched out of us. The idea that we deserve to be seen for who we are. I feel like children are taught the opposite of that. And I think it comes out as a crisis later in life. And I don't know if it's like sort of my age or stage of life, but I think people go through a stage where they're like, I want to be heard. I want my voice to be, one that's out there. And then I feel like it's a much deeper emotional thing to say, I'm not sure if I've ever been seen for who I really am.
And what do you know as a scientist and a woman studying all of this work in ancient wisdom specifically about what happens to us when we are seen?
Oh, I thought you were going to ask it the other way around. So
Ooh.
This is one of those things, maybe like compassion or volunteering, where the key to unlocking it is to move away from thinking about ourselves to what we can do for others. And I really haven't thought about this before, and you are like such a wonderful conversationalist, that if I leave this building today, I'm going to meet a very good friend, and then I return to London and I just like tweak the way that I interact with people that I tweak with. And I think about how I can make that person feel seen. I think that the benefits of that would come back to me 100-fold. And it's an experiment I'm going to try.
I love that you flipped it around to what happens to you. It's sort of like in the gratitude research where you see that like you express gratitude to someone, but they actually also get the dopamine hit. And then it's like this back and forth thing that you don't expect. Right. I hadn't thought about it in that way. I immediately, probably selfishly in some way, thought like, who are the people I feel most seen with? But not, how can I make sure that people around me feel really seen? It takes care.
It takes attention. I mean, very small things I think will really help people, because they might just, I feel like some people might leave this conversation thinking I don't really know what they mean. So I want to make it really clear. One is eye contact, good eye contact, because that's literally physically seeing, not looking around. Is there someone more interesting around? Is my phone going?
Where's my phone?
Exactly. And then the other one that I give this as a homework to sometimes my coaching clients, but also to my classes at MIT Sloan, which is go home tonight and listen to your child for 5 minutes without having your phone anywhere near you. And again, there has not been one person that hasn't come back to me and said, oh my goodness, my child told me things they've never told me before.
Okay, Dr. Tara, I'm going to have you complete these 3 statements. Better humans are.
Better humans are people who have a purpose that transcends themselves.
Better work is.
Better work is something that induces neuroplasticity in your brain. So like you're always learning new things.
Nice. A better world has.
Oh, it's got to be like more love, more kindness.
Thank you so much for being here. I've loved getting to sit down with you and have you here. It was
Thank
great.
you for having me, Leah.
That was Dr. Tara Swart, author of The Source, The Secrets of the Universe, The Science of the Brain, and podcast host of Reinvent Yourself. If this conversation resonated with you, share it with the first person who comes to mind. You never know how it could help them out. And support other people like you in finding our show by leaving us a rating before you go. While you're at it, write a one-sentence review telling me what you love about Everyday Better. Myself and the team are so excited to hear from you. And as always, you can get me in your inbox by signing up for our weekly personal development newsletter giving you practical tips on how to level up with small steps every day. Find it at linkedin.com/everydaybetter. That's linkedin.com/everydaybetter. Everyday Better is a production of LinkedIn News. The episode was produced by Alexis Ramdow. Our associate producer is Grace Rubin. Asaf Gadron is our sound engineer. He makes sure we sound good in the studio. Joe DeGiorgi mixed our show. Enrique Montalvo is the executive producer of LinkedIn Editorial Productions. Dave Pond is head of news production. Courtney Koop is head of LinkedIn Original Audio and Video. Dan Roth is the editor-in-chief of LinkedIn. And I'm Leah Smart. Thanks for coming with me, and I'll see you next week.